second thing is another important one. This is gonna hit finance people hard, right? We have to be willing to compromise, right? Let me give you an example. So, working in high growth SaaS and startup kind of companies and tech companies, one of the compromising we always made was with sales, right? Like, yeah, you're working in a high growth business, you're trying to cross that chasm of getting new customers, right? And sometimes you have salespeople that are, they looking at that, they're looking at that contract and they're like, hey, we need to send them stuff. We need to have this great dinner. We need to have these multiple runs. We need to go visit them. And in finance, right, you're looking at all this cost that's going into this particular prospect or this particular vertical or this particular territory, right? And sometimes I would sit back and say, Chris, like, don't go into completely like, why are we spending this much money? Why are we doing this? Like, find ways to compromise, right? Like find which battles do you really want to go down and which ones do you kind of want to understand a little bit more and say, all right, I'll be a little bit more flexible in that, right? And one of the things I sat down with our sales leader with was like, hey man, like let's come up with a way of where it makes sense based on the particular prospect that we're looking at, right? So if we're looking at, a $2 to $5,000 MRR, which is a 33, 24,000 to $60,000 ARR contract, right? How can we come together and find what's a reasonable prospecting expense kind of timeline with that, right? Like if we're looking at MRR contract that's like six figures or seven figures, that's a different story, right? But where can we find like common ground where it makes sense, where your team still feels empowered and still feels like they can go have the conversations and make that investment in the client and do those things, but it's also within reason based on the particular prospect contract that we're looking at, right? So that was a compromise that we made, right? It wasn't me going to the salesperson and saying, no, 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 this is it. If you go above this, like we've got to escalate this. Like you've got to have that flexibility to compromise and say like you're not going to agree on everything, right? Like finance and the business, we're not going to probably see eye to eye on every single item, but which one of those are the most ones we want to be flexible on, and which ones do we need to be very, 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 very direct and like, hey, man, this is where we need to make sure we're tight, but here's where I'm willing to flex and like come into that conversation. And most importantly, like having that conversation, right? Don't just immediately go to your business partners and say, nope, this is like, here's my laundry list of 10 different things, and I need you to do all 10 of them, right? I think one of the common misconceptions business partners and work a lot of times with CFOs is like, and in finance organizations, is we're so much about commanding the business. Like we command the business to do things. We need to be more obviously collaborative. And a big step in that is making sure that we're open to compromise, right? Like we're willing to find elements where it's like, hey, I'm gonna meet you where you are on these sets of topics, right? I'm gonna meet you where you are in terms of investment that you're gonna have in prospecting. I'm gonna meet you where you are in terms of technology adoption that you want to have in your team, right? I'm gonna meet you where you are in terms of bringing on more talent in your organization, right? I'm gonna meet you there, but my ask is you meet me on these elements, right? That when we're looking at prospecting, here's the kind of budgets that we want to look at, right? If we're looking at technology adoptions, here's from a contract perspective, we want finance to be involved with this. So I'm going to meet you where you are, but also I want you to meet me on some elements as well too, right? So it's that constant like balance. And sometimes in finance, and I'm going to tell everybody right now and everybody watching this, right? Sometimes those you have to look at the better and longer term good of making that compromise, right? Like, and you have to think strategically about it. Is like, man, if I'm really pushing this, what could be the short term, mid term, and long term outcome of our relationship, right? Because a lot of times you can go down what I call like one way doors, where it's like you go through that door, you're not coming back from it, right? And I like to keep collaborative relationships as like two-way doors, right? You can go through it, you can come back out of it, you can go through it, come back out of it. There's this constant like fluidity in terms of how we collaborate. But the most important point around that is that starts with being willing to compromise, right? and I gave you some use cases around it, right? Don't command so much of the business. Don't command so much in that relationship and that business partnership that you have. Make sure you're willing to come to the table to meet the business partners, your external stakeholders, the people that you work with in finance. Make sure you want it willing to meet them where they are, right?